preparing to live stream the meeting. And I think that's us live, which is a bit odd because now I can see myself delayed like 3 or 4 seconds behind what I'm actually doing. Okay. So we wait for the viewing figures to pick up a little bit before we actually dive in, because at the moment there's 3 people. Not that the 3 people aren't welcome, but I tell you what, I shall also mute that because we don't want that feeding back either. So people are starting to drip in, which is good. You guys all comfortable?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Alrighty. And all of a sudden the messages start smashing into my phone. Impatient people. Where is it? Where do I click? Well, I would say to those people who aren't watching now, just go to YouTube and I'm sure you'll find it very easily. Try and keep an eye on those questions. Right, if I grab this very specific link and then head over to Facebook. And share that. Post. We've now got 11 people. Okay, guys, thank you. You are there. We acknowledge your existence and we're thrilled to have you with us. We're going to start in a very short moment. And one of the first things we're going to ask our guests to do is to introduce themselves. Before I actually do that, let's try once just letting you guys know about how you can ask questions. If you try and ask questions in the chat on YouTube, it's likely with all the different screens that we've got going on that they won't get picked up. So if questions should go through the, let me get this right, Slido app, Slido. I'm gonna post that in. There's the address. It's in the chat on YouTube as well. So you click on that and you can ask questions. You can have a look at the other questions that people have asked and you can upvote them, downvote them, whatever it is. So we get the questions that we want answered. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Are you all there?
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah.
Good evening.
You are, that's great. Okay, so some of you will be very well known to people in our church community. Some of you will be a little bit less well known, maybe Phil. Although if anybody joined in 2 weeks ago, they'll know you intimately. But of course, this is going out on the internet, so we can presume that there are people who are watching, that will watch, who have never been to anything that we've done as a church. So can we go around? I'll look at you and then you introduce yourself. Will that work? No, probably have to name you. So just tell us who you are and why you think you've been invited to take part in this round table this evening. Julie, can you kick us off?
Hi, my name's Julie Terry. I'm a mental health nurse. I went into mental health nursing primarily because I really wanted to work with people. When I was 18, I started working in insurance and I wasn't very good with numbers. I was quite frustrated by that. And so I started doing voluntary work. And one night a week at the local sports centre, I used to work with people with mental health problems. It's very laid back. We'd play Scrabble, have a couple of pints and go out to different places for meals. And that it was happened to be run by the local mental health nurses. And they said to me, why don't you do your nursing training? And within a matter of months, I've been interviewed and started my training, which was in Essex. So for me, nursing has been an excellent way to come into mental health. I remember that I've always been interested in people, what makes us tick, why we are like we are, because we're funny folk, really. And so it was really that, and that's been 30 years ago for me. So my interest in mental health and people has never waned. It's something that I think is really, really important.
That's cool. Thank you. Charlotte, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So I'm Charlotte Davis. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist, just about hopefully to qualify in a few months' time. So I've been working in mental health for the last 12 years since I graduated my undergraduate degree in psychology. And I've worked in a variety of different ways in mental health. So working in research, working as an assistant psychologist in child and adolescent mental health, neurodevelopmental conditions like autism, and then also with charities like Havel, working with severe and enduring mental illness. And yeah, I think recently we did a little thing in our teaching about why we've gone into clinical psychology. And it's that picture of a tree. So the roots are the things from like my past, my background that would influence why I want to do clinical psychology. And I identified things like having friends that had mental illness when I was younger and a teenager, and feeling really useless and not knowing what to do, what to say, how to help. And then we look at like the trunk then is like your values and why you as a person want to do the job that you're doing. And I think like my faith is such a massive part of that, because I think it gives me those values of I want to care for people, I want to love people, I want people to be supported, I want everyone to have access to support in the same way. So that's sort of my trunk and my roots that I think help show why I want to do clinical psychology. And people might not know what a clinical psychologist does, so I'll just very briefly say what we do. So we're trained in different therapeutic approaches. So I'm trained in cognitive behavioural therapy and in systemic therapy, which I can explain if people are interested, but I won't go into it because it'll take me half an hour. And yeah, so we're trained in those approaches, but we work in lots of different ways. So working with teams, working in systems, to trying to make sense of what's going on for people that have got mental illness or even physical health conditions. So clinical psychologists work in any health context. So I think that explains a bit about me.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Phil, do you want to share?
Well, it just says it's great to be in such esteemed company tonight. So it's lovely. I'm really appreciating this. I'm a pastor, but my interest in this area is that before going into the ministry, I was a physiotherapist working in Cardiff. And I was very fortunate. My first placement, which was back in 1984, was in Velindre, which is cancer hospital, but it also meant we operated out of Whitchurch Hospital, which interestingly and unusually for physiotherapy was a centre of excellence for physiotherapy and psychiatry for the whole of the UK. It had a very, very fascinating boss, very forward thinking. She was a lovely lady, Methodist lady from Aberystwyth. Her Martin Lloyd-Jones used to stay at their house every year, and with some great interesting chats about issues of faith. But she sort of put me on a trajectory, which so I worked in what might call a normal physio setting for probably about 18 months, and then decided to specialize in mainly adult mental health, though I did have some involvement in an adolescent unit. And during that time, I worked in Whitchurch Hospital for probably about another 18 months or so. And then the remainder of my time, I moved over to the University Hospital Wales, where they wanted a physio to look at the reasons why people come to physios with back pain and neck pain, that it isn't necessarily organic. And at that time, the classic physio response was to say it's all in the mind and discharge the patient. So they wanted to see if they could do more, ended up running a stress management service, interestingly, with a fellow who'd been a Roman Catholic priest, a lovely guy, and a very, just a very free thinker, nearest to a genius that I've ever seen. And he and I worked that. So looking at things like pain, which wasn't of an organic origin, the whole kind of somatic stress thing. And I also covered an acute admission ward in UHW, which was a teaching, being a research unit as well, was very interesting. So I went into the ministry in 1990 and immediately saw terrific overlap from many of the things I saw prior to being in the ministry with mental health. You were seeing pastorally. I was in West Yorkshire in a church there for 5 years. It was a big church. There were a lot of mental health issues. But in a way, if I'm really honest, I didn't really connect the two areas of my Christian thinking and my work as a pastor with the world I'd come from, which of course was quite a secular world. But more, I would say probably the last 10 years, I've done a lot more thinking and almost bringing the two a little more closer and seeing what we can learn from one another. And certainly, yeah, the last 10 years, I've kind of reignited my interest in reading and studying in this area and practice as well, obviously, as a pastor.
So, Phil, you are a pastor. Charlotte, Julie, you're members of our church, so you're all Christians. What are your thoughts, just like quickly, broadly speaking, on how faith and mental health, mental well-being overlap? Do you see any kind of barriers between the two? Any stigmas in one area from the other? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a very good question, Sammy. I think Phil started some conversations in the part one of the lockdown programme, thinking about the role of church in supporting people with mental health problems, and that churches and people in faith communities can do an incredible amount in terms of offering support and reaching out to people, which I think is really important, and also being aware of where sometimes we need to think, hang on a minute, do we need some mental health professional help here? So I think there are some of those type of issues in terms of the church has a role in the community to support people in need, and whether that's food bank, parent and toddlers, mental health issues, I think there are a number of roles there. Yeah, not quite sure what else.
So you would say, just to summarize that then, because Christians, people of faith, are supposed to be caring, serving, loving, mental health is just one arena in which Christians should be active in providing the sort of support like we were chatting about 2 weeks ago.
Yes, and I think it's also worth bearing in mind that mental health is a subject that the large majority of people may want to help, but also sometimes don't know how. And Charlotte mentioned this at the start. Lots of people have quite a bit of fear around mental illness, despite the fact that 1 in 4 of us will have a mental health problem at any one time. So it's a lot of people. But sometimes we still can worry about doing or saying the right thing. So it can be a tricky subject.
Well, what about Charlotte and Phil? So maybe answer from your professional point of view, like what stigmas of faith, Charlotte, are there in the world of mental health? And Phil, what stigmas of mental health care are there, do you think, in the world of faith? You can race to answer that one.
Ladies first.
Good way.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's a tough one when you're working for the National Health Service, because my faith can't come into it in the therapy room if the other person isn't believing or even if the other person doesn't bring it up or doesn't want to talk about it. And things we call self-disclosures, so talking about me in the therapy room, where it depends which therapeutic sort of approach I'm using, but really generally we don't tend to disclose very much about ourselves. So I see things that I would notice about how faith and mental health or mental illness interact, but I can't often bring it up or notice that in the room with somebody. So, but I think, like Julie was saying, the church can have such a preventative role in mental health, because what we know about why a lot of people struggle with things is because they might become isolated for whatever reason that is, and actually social connections, being around people, being with people, being supported is so important and preventative, that the church has a huge role just in that, in being with people and loving people. So that's what I'd add to that as well, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting from the church perspective. You know, sometimes quite a few Christians are quite nervous, really, of admitting mental health struggles to start with, which often is the big challenge. It's part of a wider package, I think, in church life. You know, you ask people, how are you? And everybody's fine, which is not true. I always think, like, there's an American pastor called A.W. Tozer, and he once said, Christians don't tell lies, they sing them in their hymns. And I think he's absolutely right. But it's not a willful thing. It's just almost like you can develop a church culture where everybody's, you know, great to see you, how are you, wonderful, yeah, you know, and there's almost a pressure to be okay. Once you get down through that, and perhaps you discover Christians who do have perhaps some very real mental health struggles, there's often a fear of going outside of the church, even to the GP. There's often suspicion, I find, amongst Christians, even of medication, even at its most basic level. And I think this is because sometimes we think as Christians that anything to do with thoughts and emotions is really the domain of God in the totality. Now, we know that's true. All right, don't get me wrong on that. But we sometimes fail to recognize that God, in his what we would know as common grace, has enabled others also to just observe the way we sometimes respond with our thought patterns and our emotional responses. And so sometimes Christians will say, well, you know, if I'm going to see, for example, a psychologist like Charlotte, or a mental health nurse like Julia, you know, I want them to be a Christian. And often I find when I unpick that, behind that is a kind of belief that somehow they're going to say that the root of my problem is my Christian faith. And that goes back to, I think, a very old model, which was there actually amongst some people who are working in the area of mental health, but a very long time ago. And you just won't really find that now. I think most psychologists and psychiatrists will view the Christian worldview actually as a therapeutic tool to say, how can I help and work with this person with their worldview? And so a lot of the sort of the rejection of Christian values has gone, but sadly the kind of suspicion that it's still there lingers. And there are, of course, some Christian writers who would totally write off any what they would regard as secular help, arguing that it all comes from a flawed philosophical position. Scientific naturalism has no room for God and the work of the Holy Spirit. So yeah, the stigma within Christians is often a stigma of acknowledging I have a problem, and then perhaps reluctance to engage with services that are there out of a sense of suspicion that somehow they're anti-Christian.
I suppose it's interesting to think, how do health professionals help, in a sense that I vividly remember walking along at, lots of you will know Spring Harvest is a Christian festival. I was walking along with a friend we were talking and not looking where we were going, and bang, she walked right into a fire exit staircase, and there was quite a nasty injury on her head. And of course she's, you know, on the floor bleeding, and my first instinct was to think, water, kitchen roll, let's clean you up and help you to be all right. And the next person, their first instinct was to start praying. And I thought, wow. And this is something that since that time, I really held on to this, that we all may have a different first instinct with something, but how very much God puts us in different places to serve through what might be the NHS or the independent sector or private counselling. And actually that can happen through a number of different ways, through practical ways, through people praying. So when you think of kind of how is the hand of God in a situation, I think it is quite, it's a many-faceted approach, really.
Yeah, I think building on that, I think from a church perspective, pastor's perspective, I'd never, as it were, abandon someone to, you know, and just say, well, just go off, get yourself sorted, and then come back. You know, I think the church and Christian supportive friends can, and the area of prayer particularly, can walk side by side with someone, perhaps as they go through a process of healing.
Just one observation I check out there is that mental health seems to be something that is known and spoken about on one level more than ever. It's in the news. We're encouraged, you know, to post statuses if you're feeling low, if you feel like nobody cares, you can always come and chat to me, that sort of thing. That we could name things like depression, like anxiety, what have you. So in one sense, they're spoken about and kind of out there more than ever, but in another sense, they're still an utter mystery to folk. Like we'd still have the most basic questions of what actually counts as depression, what actually counts as mental health or mental health issues. How would you actually respond if somebody took you up on that? We say about accessing services, but presumably we've got no idea really what services are out there and things like that. So it's kind of like we're living in a fuzzy grey area at the moment, would be my unqualified observation. So there we are. Right. A question for you then that's come in, and it's exploring the idea of preventative medicine, if that makes sense. So let me just read it out as it is written. What can people do to get off to a strong start with mental wellness? Like you to do exercise and eat healthily if you wanted a healthy body, what to prevent health issues developing there. What can people do to get off to a strong start with mental wellness?
I think sleep and diet and exercise are just as important for your mental health. So that's one thing to say, that's not just limited to physical health, but those are hugely important things. I think, like from my perspective, things that I've learned is to allow yourself to feel the way that you feel. So I think as a culture and as a society, we want to say, oh, well, why am I feeling like that? I shouldn't be feeling like that. Or just stop it. You know, I don't want to feel this way. So I just want to stop it. But it's just allowing yourself to feel the way that you do. And that is something that is, hugely helpful, because then you're not then judging yourself or making it worse by saying, I shouldn't be doing this, because that what ends up happening then is that you think, that it just gets worse and worse because you're putting that judgment and pressure on yourself. So it's about being kind to yourself and talking to yourself in a way that you'd hope other people would talk to you as well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot to be said for being around people who are encouraging and supportive. Sometimes we really need help to reach out to people if we're going through a difficult time. I was going through quite a difficult time a few weeks ago, and it took a friend to say, Julie, I'm here, ring me. And it was only those kind of prompts that I actually took that person up on that. So I think awareness of how we are and things that we might be struggling with, because you could say that we all want, if we're feeling grim, we want to feel better. This is not nice feeling low or unhappy or angry. We want to feel better. And so what do we do? So sometimes as people, we look for a quick fix. And, you know, that could be a healthy strategy, like taking the dog for a longer walk, or, you know, a bit of yoga, or, you know, something, cup of tea with a friend, social distance. But actually, there are lots of quick fixes that we reach for that can have further implications, mental health-wise, physical health-wise. And so we know that the supermarkets have been selling a lot more alcohol during lockdown, not just because the pubs are closed, but because people are trying to cope. People try to cope in a number of different ways, and that might be through using substances that long-term might give you more problems, and thinking about things like self-harm. I mean, I've just mentioned about alcohol and substances. They can be considered ways that we can be actually harming ourselves in the long term. And there are many other types of self-harm, which I'm sure people who are watching can be aware of. And I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying have some awareness of whether that is on a level or getting worse, and is it something that you need to reach out and get some help about.
Great. And I think, you know, those things of honesty and to yourself and being kind to yourself and friends, those things are really valuable. And I'd add another couple. One is, which is actually a biblical principle, really. It's the principle of having a day of rest, which opens up the whole area of the rhythm between work and rest. I think during lockdown, the boundaries of going, say, to the office or to the factory or wherever you work, and then leaving stuff, you know, there's a distinction between home and work. Okay, some of it will leak in. Maybe if you're a teacher, for example, a lot will. But now those boundaries have gone, or rather they've been blurred fairly heavily. And so I think fighting to have a period of time, and again, the Bible makes kind of the position that's put to us is that one day in 7 should be a day that's different to the other days. And there are lots of reasons for that, but I think at its basic level, it's the way we've been designed, and we function much better if we have what's, you know, has been called a Sabbath, a break or a sabbatical during the week. The other thing I think is the importance of what a friend of mine calls soul time, which is actually just having the opportunity to be quiet within the day. I think there's a lot of interest in this now with things like mindfulness. Everything's been called mindfulness now, when quite honestly, a lot of it isn't. But it's interesting. See, from a Christian point of view, you'd probably want to start the day with God. So, you know, it might mean getting yourself some quiet, which could be very difficult in your home right now, but it's worth fighting for. And it's time to be reflective and time to consider what lies ahead in the day. And if you're a Christian, you'll obviously want to put that in a bigger context than just yourself and the day ahead of you, which is your relationship with God. If you're not a Christian, it's interesting. I think the soul time concept, you actually get a glimpse of this sometimes when maybe you're going for a nice walk out in the countryside or down by the coast, you know, and you're on the beach at something like Kevin Sheedon or something like that. And suddenly there's this sense that there is more in the universe than just you and your problems, and maybe even a sense of peace. You might even call it well-being. That's actually just a glimpse, I would argue, of what the Christian actually has as a result of their relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And it's important that Christians nurture that. That is so powerful, I think, for just good mental health on a daily basis.
Can I follow you up on a couple of the things that you all said, just really to help put flesh on the bones for people if they want to respond? Charlotte, you started off, you said, oh, well, nutrition and exercise are good for your mental health as well as your physical health. what would that look like? I mean, you can just say to someone, oh, exercise is good for you. Where would someone start? What level of exercise is good for mental health? What level of sleep is good for mental health, so on?
Yeah, so I think, mental being, when you're mentally ill, that is something that will affect both of those things. So, it'll disrupt sleep patterns. It will change what you want to eat, how much you're eating, and all of that sort of thing, how much you want to move. There's a lot of people I've worked with who just move it away from Caleb there. Lots of people I've worked with who feel like they can't move with their mental illness at all, so they become really immobilized completely and utterly. So it's understanding that actually, first off, that it's not just a quick fix of, you need to sleep better and eat better, because that can be really, really tough. But they are so important to us. So getting sleep where you are going to sleep at a decent time, and waking up at a decent time. Lots of people I work with will have sleep patterns that are reversed. So they'll be asleep in the day and awake at night, or just unable to sleep and really getting only a few hours per night, things like that. That has a massive impact on how much we can concentrate, focus, attend to things. And then we start judgments which make problem. So I'm useless, I can't even concentrate on this, I can't even talk to my friend, and those sort of things. So that will have huge on how
Charlotte, you've turned into a Dalek, my darling. I love you very much, but you've turned into a Dalek. She can't hear me.
Getting your body moving. Sorry?
You turned into a Dalek. The microwave went on, and for those of you who aren't in our home, you know that our router is right next to the microwave. So obviously that's stuffed us up. So we got to
sleep, wasn't it?
You was just starting about sleep. Some people get a couple of hours of sleep and what have you.
Okay, yeah. So lots of people's sleep patterns can be disrupted. And it's really important just to try and get that back to normal. So practical advice is out there. Things like Cerebra is a good place to look, or just if you Google sleep hygiene, there's lots of information that's freely available just to have a look and see, actually, what should I be doing then to get my sleep back on track? And with exercise, and Phil would know way more about this than me, but just the things that I do with people would be just to get them moving as much as they can, little bits. Getting the body actually started can have a huge impact. So yeah, whether it's doing something small like rocking yourself just to soothe yourself, or whether it's doing like some yoga or stretches or things like that would just get your body moving and help you to feel a bit better.
Shall I say a little bit about exercise? Because I think, it's a fascinating area, and I know there've been some studies which have shown like mild to moderate depression responds quite well to regular exercise, but it needs to be exercise falls into two categories. You have aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic is the stuff where you perhaps can run for a long time or walk for a long time. That's really good exercise, I think, for mental health. The Lord has designed the human body to be put under a strain. So he's actually designed your heart and your bones and your muscles to be put under pressure. If you don't put them under pressure, you physically start to deteriorate. That's why, for example, somebody who's ill in a hospital bed for a very long time, if they're allowed to just lie there, eventually you'll die. You need to be, because that's the way the Lord has made us. And there's terrific advantages. As you exercise, the body gives up. You probably heard of things like endorphins, and enkephalins. They're the kind of feel-good stuff. It's why sometimes you know you've got to hoover the house and you can't face it, and you do it, and afterwards you think, actually, I did sort of slightly enjoy that, and why did it take me so long to get round to it? The reason you're thinking like that is your endorphins. And if you can, but the problem people have with exercise is they often get put off early on, either by not knowing how to go about it, or once they start, they absolutely hammer themselves into the ground and have a bad experience. And a really good thing you could try is like the Couch to 5K app, which really is designed for non-runners, but it's an excellent way over a period of weeks, nice, steady, gradual progressions can move you on. The great thing about exercise as well is it builds a sense of, in the right sense, of self-worth. When you start to see yourself maybe losing some weight, and your friends start to say, oh, perhaps you run or you swim or you cycle or something like that, and you realize they're slightly impressed. That can be really good for you if maybe the only voices you've heard have been very, very negative. So you start to feel better and you start to see change. One word of caution though, you can go over the top a bit, and then exercise can become counterproductive. So trying to use it as a tool really is the thing.
And then the other thing I wanted to pick up on was the wrong coping strategies that you started looking into, Julie. So there were lots of right coping strategies, and they fall kind of, in broadly speaking, into some of the categories we've already spoken about. But what are some of the kind of the typical things that people do in order for a quick pick-me-up that ultimately start being destructive rather than constructive to our well-being?
I suppose it's good to think about these in a fairly mild way. So we're starting to hear about the lockdown easing on shops, and of course retail therapy, quick fix, go and buy something, that'd be great, feel better, new pair of trousers, whatever. Quick chocolate bar, that'll make me feel better, just quick fix. And we do live in a kind of quick fix world. We're looking for instant solutions very often. And actually, if we start to do more of that, a lot more of that, suddenly something can become, it can become almost addictive. And so I suppose a lot of anything, my mum always taught me all things in moderation. There's a lot of truth in that. So whether we are doing online gambling or whatever it might be, suddenly these things can spiral into concerning debt or concerning eating habits or things that have just gone further than we meant them to, without us ever having, the awareness that it would pan out like that. I've met a lot of people over the years who cut themselves, and there's a whole awareness around why people do that in the first place. Very often people will do things because they need help and they need attention and should get that help, certainly. And I think sometimes people feel they didn't know what to do, and they felt they had to do something. And I think the something to do is the reaching out, if we can do that. I think it's just having that awareness of what we're doing, and seeing who's around who could perhaps help us. Sometimes we're very reliant on other people noticing as well, really.
Sammy, you're muted.
Muted, because we've moved on now from the microwave to Weetabix, which is making a right racket in the background.
Great.
Okay, here's another question from the... Oh, it's been upvoted, it's just changed. Another question from the app. Isn't the best person to help you through mental health issues somebody who has experienced mental health issues themselves? It's more of a statement and a question all rolled into one. So what do you make of that?
I think that's a really valid point. That I think, which I really love about my profession, is that we take people with what we call people with lived experience of those issues. So they're part of my course and of teaching, in designing services, in getting feedback from services about how they could improve and things like that. And it's so important. I think there are peer mentors across South Wales, where someone with a lived experience of a mental illness will buddy up with someone who's maybe just starting out in a service and getting help for the first time. And it's so valuable to know, okay, that person's gone through it and they've come out the other side. And that's so encouraging to people. So I do think there's huge value in that. And I think, and there's value in professionals who haven't had lived experience, but are trained in different ways to help and support. So I think there's both, really. I think really good point, though.
It's interesting. My favorite New Testament book is 2 Corinthians, and it begins with a terrific statement about God, but also the way he comforts us so that we can comfort others. I'll just read these verses to you, actually. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles. That's a great statement. But then it goes on to say, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. And I do think, as Charlotte says there, probably, it's so valuable if you can find somebody who really has walked part of the path, maybe, that you're walking, and has found support and found help and found comfort. And the biggest things you need when you're really struggling with your mental health, particularly when it's getting a little bit more challenging, is the issue of hope. And holding out hope is really important, that's done in a reasonable way. And those verses are really helpful when reminding us from a Christian perspective that I believe if you're a Christian and you struggle with mental health issues and the Lord has been a great comfort to you, you should be really on the front line of helping other Christians with the experience, the comfort that you've received. Yeah.
It just also reminds me that in our wonderful but very strapped National Health Service, we are extremely reliant on our third sector organisations. And Charlotte mentioned HAVA at the beginning. Of course, we've got Mind and a number of different mental health charities who we just wouldn't function without them. And very often our third sector will be made up of people who've experienced mental health problems. People can give that hope and do certainly know what it's like. The mental health system is a strange thing in many ways. People for many years have had things done to them. They can experience services as very controlling, lots of waiting lists. So it can often seem that the power is not in the hands of the patient. And I think people with lived experience really understand that and really know what that's like. So I think there's some really helpful questions coming in from people who are watching.
Julia, do you think that churches could actually do more in the third sector area in mental health?
Yes, I'm sure we could. I think, we would know locally in Ammanford some of the services that we've got available. And I know that there are certainly people in Ammanford Evangelical Church who are supporting a number of different mental health initiatives up and down the Amman Valley. And I think that's, really fantastic. I suppose in terms of communication, we could always do more to share and tell the wider community about what's on, even if we are just simply making sure that people know about them, just to promote them. So people I think you need to tell people things a number of times and in a number of ways to make sure that people know what is near them. Very often there can be support groups just, literally within half a mile of where people live, and we haven't always had that information. So I think, churches could do more to get involved with third sector.
Okay, I'm just going to chuck in my own question here. This isn't from the app. This is just a thought that's come into my head of responding to what you guys are saying there. What would you say would be the dangers or the pitfalls of one of the two scenarios of seeking help from someone who knows you very well already and who you know very well already, you know, which is kind of the sort of the low level stuff we've been speaking about so far. Just chat to friends, look out for each other, encourage each other, versus seeking like the more clinical help from someone who doesn't know you at all and you don't know them at all. Is one kind of set of relationships preferable, or are there pitfalls on both sides? What do you think?
Well, I suppose there's always a risk when we open ourselves up for help. It is always a step forward. It's a step of faith in a sense, which kind of reminds us as Christians that, you know, it's good to pray about, you know, how we step forwards and seek help. I think because there has been such a stigma around mental health issues for a very long time, we always worry what people will think of us, what people might, you know, say to us, and people have that difficulty with how do we respond in the first place. So I think, yes, we worry about opening ourselves up, and yet generally most people are on our side. Most people want to reach out and support and you know, and offer a kind of, you know, emotional shoulder to cry on, really. And equally, what do people worry about in terms of seeking professional help? Well, I think the reality is very often people don't know what mental health services are out there and what might be their experience when they go along. So Charlotte and Phil, do please interrupt me in a moment, but this is just some stuff that I share regularly in the classroom. So if we were to go to our GP to seek help because we've been feeling very low or very down for quite a long while, we would hope to be listened to. We would hope that they would ask us a number of questions to do a quick assessment on how we were, you know, how this was, how bad things were. And one of the things that we find that primary care or GP does more and more of nowadays is to recommend some type of mental health education, mental health promotion, depending, as I say, depending on how we were. If people thought that by changing some of our habits, sleep, diet that we've been talking about, would help somebody, then some of these programs, they can be called stress management. They might be, you know, learning to live, living life to the full. They go under a number of different names, stress pack, locally, and some of them have been put on in the Ammanford Pensioners Hall and a number of areas I can think of around Carmarthenshire. So they're run by professionals, they're information sessions, and probably we should all go because they would be really informative. So when we don't know what's going to happen when we seek out for help, so it might be that we get recommended some kind of mental health promotion education program. It might be that we are given a prescription of medication and trialing that for a short period to see if that helps and makes a difference. So very often we have to do things alongside that ourselves. So there's quite a lot of responsibility that comes with improving our mental health. And as Charlotte said, we very often don't always feel like doing the exercise, you know, going for a walk, things like that. So also what we need to be aware of is if things have really become extremely difficult for us and maybe people are worried about our safety, or, you know, things have really deteriorated quite a lot, then maybe GPs might refer us on to a mental health service, maybe a psychiatrist or the local community mental health team. And we're always unsure, well, what will happen when I get there? Because lots of our services, if you were to Google mental health services and the area where you live, you'll get some useful information about teams, but people are not always sure, well, you know, what will happen when I get there? And some of our services are now getting a lot better at putting details on websites, information leaflets, so that people do actually know what will happen when they first make that phone call or go along for an appointment.
Sort of taking away the fear of the unknown in that respect.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you'd recommend, if you ever were pointed in that direction by GP or by your pastor or by your friend or what have you, you could do some research yourself even before you go, to take away some of the anxiety of of what you might be stepping into.
Absolutely, and ask questions. You know, what will happen when I get there? What do I need to do? You know, can I take a friend or family member along with me? Just keep asking questions, because I think, you know, information is power. The more we know about what will happen, and that goes for all health issues, really.
Mm. Phil, Charlotte, any thoughts on the benefits or the consequences of knowing someone well and being known well by them, as opposed to you know, a complete stranger?
I think the difficulty of getting help from somebody who really knows you well, and I have this challenge quite often as a pastor, because you know, often people who I'm engaging with, I've known for years, I've known them fairly well. The key thing then, I think, is to try and develop some sort of boundaries within the way in which you're helping someone. So for example, when I first started in ministry, somebody say, "Oh, you know, I need to talk. I'm really struggling." Great, and I think, like, I'll give you however long you want. You know, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever. And it was just so counterproductive. It just didn't help people. Whereas now, what I'm very keen, I'll say to someone, "Well, I'll see you once a week for an hour." Now you put a framework around that so that if there's a crisis or something and they really do need to contact you, they can, and it's almost an agreed arrangement between us. But I think when it's somebody who knows you really well, say you've got a friend who's starting to get a little depressed and is just struggling with anxiety maybe during lockdown, it's very easy as a Christian to feel you must just open your heart and your life to that person as a blank check. That isn't always such a good thing. It's better to keep, so, you know, a regular kind of structured boundary with some sort of boundaries between you. It makes the help a lot more effective, I think.
Do you think that especially as a pastor, or would that be in all sort of relationships? Because one of the other questions we've got come through is, would the best person to spot mental health issues be a close friend, and therefore, you know, be a strong role for church members looking out for each other?
I think there's a lot in that, in that people, often the changes in us are subtle changes of behavior that general public or people who don't know you very well are not necessarily going to pick up. But the difficulty with somebody who knows you well is that somehow maybe they need to sort of take that step of saying, "Are you all right? How are you doing?" And that's sometimes a bit challenging for people to do. But yeah, I think people who know you well probably theoretically should be able to spot stuff. It's what they do with it then is the challenge.
Dr. Davis?
Not yet. I think I was just going to add to the last bit. I think it can be about trust. And I think if there's someone you really trust to talk it through with, and you feel that that's going to be the support that you need, then I think that's fantastic. I have spoken to people who it's easier to trust a stranger who is bound by confidentiality than it is necessarily to trust a friend, and being that bit unsure about whether that's actually going to get out and things like that. And you know, that's a great part of being part of a church, is that we have that resource, we have people there, but it's still, I suppose, a church of sinners and people who make mistakes. And that's the thing, it can be a bit scary if you think, oh, is this going to get out or not? So that's the other thing, yeah, I would think about is trust. And yeah, I can't remember what the last question was.
That's fine. We've covered it, and we should crack on because there are quite a few other questions actually. One's come in, and this is how it's phrased. I have met some people who appeared dominant, but underneath were quite insecure. Can you comment on these sorts of situations?
Yeah, I think that can be a way for people to cope, isn't it? If you feel quite insecure, then you can react in the completely opposite way and be more domineering over people. Some people who are dominant might not be insecure, mind you, they might just be very confident and think that they hold the power. And like Julie was saying, there can be a lot about power often with people. So yeah, I do think people do tend to act in opposite ways to how they're feeling to try and counteract it.
I suppose we don't ever know where that dominance has necessarily come from, and how if it's a dominance that's actually quite not just annoying, but almost bordering on the harmful to other people. We have all learned over the years that people who we might experience as being bullying, that might come from something back in that person's own past. So I guess it's back to we all are individuals, and we all may operate in different ways for different reasons. So we don't always know what's going on until we get to know people a bit more sometimes.
And people are hugely complex. That's the thing I've learned the most, is that we are the most complex things on earth, and trying to understand what goes on in our minds is a tough job. So yeah, trying to boil it down to why might someone be doing that is a really difficult thing.
Another question then that's come in, what mistakes can be made when Christians attempt to help other Christians who may be struggling with mental health issues? What are the, I guess, common mistakes that we can then seek to avoid making ourselves?
Those immediate things that spring to mind are where people can very quickly say, I know how you feel, when we may not know how that person feels at all, where we make assumptions. And that can be that thinking, oh, somebody's can't be that bad, when actually they are feeling really very bad indeed. So I suppose there's something about not paying enough attention to the person. We can get things very wrong sometimes. We know professionals can do that too. I suppose again it's back to this individuality. We can panic and not know how to help somebody, and equally be amazed that 1 week later that person is doing much better, thank goodness, than we thought. So sometimes it can be hard to make a judgment, and I suppose if we're not sure what to do, the best thing we can do is provide some support and keep an eye on that person, not just ourselves, but maybe there's a few other friends who might be involved in terms of taking turns to support somebody. And there are many ways to support people, which could be through meals or a phone call or a text. So I think if we are not sure how far to go, what do we offer, what do we say, it's always fine in church to get help, of course, from our pastors and our elders. That's what people are there for, to share things with. So I think, I suppose it also depends on what that person is saying that they want. What would they find helpful themselves?
I think there's a big pressure sometimes for Christians to feel that we should be able to fix one another all the time, quite quickly. If there's a problem, it's as a result of a fallen world, sin. We need to get that fixed. So sometimes it could be a big pressure to feel you've got to sort somebody out. Where actually, I think often, most of the time with mental health stuff, people just need a friend who sometimes can. This is where Christians can be really we can be really helpful with one another, just metaphorically sitting with one another in the darkness, kind of holding someone's hand really, and being a companion in what they're going through. But yeah, classic bad response from Christians is immediately to try and fix this. And often it's in the shape of, well, you need to read this book, or you need to listen to this sermon. Or worse than that, we can start to feel or start to give the impression that the person is struggling with whatever they're struggling with because of some failure in them as a Christian. Now, that can be the case sometimes. So, if there are issues going on in someone's life as a Christian, which they know are wrong, and their conscience has been affected, and they're willfully going against what perhaps the Lord very clearly is calling them to, that will create inner turmoil and inner distress. And so sometimes there can be that connection, but sometimes there just isn't that kind of connection at all. And again, a really bad response from some Christians is to try and frame everything in that way. And all that does is effectively shame someone for being ill. And that is really not good. And, you know, I've seen some pretty extreme examples of that. And then as well, it's so easy as Christians to have a kind of Christian form of being dismissive. Oh, I'm really sorry to hear about that. I'll pray for you. And then they're on to the next thing. And what they're actually saying is, I don't really want to engage with you. And there may be all sorts of reasons for that but you need to realize that sometimes some Christians feel that finding a Christian who has maybe a longer term mental struggle is somehow a threat to their understanding of the Christian life. And so because they can't handle it, they tend to distance. But rather than saying, I just can't handle this, mate, I can't have anything to do with you, they'll frame it in a much more acceptable way by saying, I'll pray for you. I'll add you to my prayer list. But in reality, they're not really engaging. So it comes in all sorts of shapes and forms, sadly. And it can be quite common amongst us.
Yeah, and I think like a wider sort of society response, but what I've seen in the church as well is that we care far more about what it does to us than thinking about what's happening for the person. So thinking, oh, well, I feel really manipulated, or I feel like they're just doing that for attention, and I don't want to, I'm not going to give them that attention. I'm going to ignore it. And that's, I think, unfortunately, thinking more about ourselves and how it makes us feel than actually putting ourselves in their shoes and thinking, why might they be doing that? I think a lovely thing that I've read is, when Julie was talking about self-harm and people who might do that, it's thought of as a sort of cry for attention, but there's a lovely way of thinking of it instead. It's not really lovely, but it's a different way of thinking of it, is that it's a cry of pain. So actually it's more about what's going on for them internally and has to sort of come out and be shown. And it's not necessarily for you, it's about them. And I think that's really, as Christians, we can think about them, put them before us. And, let's put ourselves a little bit further down, because actually that's far more helpful for them and their mental health. And I think we do that, and we do it as a society, but we do it as Christians as well.
That's really helpful, Charlotte. It's the principle of bearing one another's burdens, isn't it? And I think it's interesting as well in like the area of trauma, how people can get easily brought, you think they're making progress. It's not like grief, is it? Grief it's kind of linear, but trauma is, you sort of going all over the place, and something can take you right back to where you were originally. And I've noticed Christians struggle with that. Somebody who's gone through a traumatic experience and is really struggling to process that, who maybe they've sat with, and particularly pastors are bad here, because sometimes they'll say, well, I've explained this to you, okay, you should have got this by now, without realizing that people can actually default right back to how they were some time ago, as a result maybe of things that are going on around them. Can I throw another negative about preachers? I think sometimes we can be really unhelpful in the way in which what we present of the normal life. So we can give this assumed position in preaching that somehow, if you're a Christian, this is the typical Christian life. And I think this is where, again, I mentioned 2 Corinthians. Paul is so refreshingly honest about his own personal struggles, particularly in chapter 1, where he actually says, I despaired even of life. I'm not sure I know many preachers who will get into a pulpit and say, you know what, I've had a really bad week. I've actually despaired of life, the fact that I'm alive. So I think there needs to be more honesty and openness about what it means to be authentically human. And then that needs to be placed within a kind of Christian paradigm.
Mm. Yeah, I was thinking today just of some other examples of people in the scripture who struggle with mental health issues. The most famous probably is Elijah. And what's remarkable in Elijah's situation, where he despairs of life, exactly like Paul states it, is that he's just experienced like the power of God massively in his life. And we kind of have this wrong thinking sometimes as Christians that if we're close to God, then that means we're immune from any struggles in life. Not just speaking mental health wise now, but I shouldn't be sad. I shouldn't have any sort of difficulties in any of my relationships, and we instantly turn things going wrong in our life into evidence that God is displeased with us and that there's judgment and there's all manners of wrong sorts of thinkings, which in the church we can use to compound these issues. And I think when we're the ones suffering from that wrong thinking, then, I hope other Christians can help us with those. But when we're applying those wrong thought process to other people who are genuinely suffering with mental ill health, then that can be really unhelpful as well, can't it?
We have a real problem in churches with shame. I think there's a huge amount of shame. It's so easy to deluge a Christian in shame. And, those examples, like you say, of Elijah, and there are many more, but I always think Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is probably one of the most shocking ones, and yet reassuring. He's speaking about being sorrowful and overwhelmed in sorrow, and yet his honesty and willingness to acknowledge that to his companions. And once you break through that and say, this is okay, it's actually okay to say these things. It's actually okay to say, I feel I don't know that I believe anymore. I mean, you just don't hear Christians say that, but Christians struggle with doubts all the time. Christians struggle with lack of conviction that, am I really a Christian? And this is actually part of the normal flow of the Christian life. And within it, God is working all the time. That's the wonderful thing. And the tragedy of it is we miss that. And we deny the reality of God working in our struggles and the opportunity to support one another. But shame is a real big problem, I think, in Christians. And it falls back to this kind of pietistic view that, that once you're a Christian, everything's sorted. Mm. And it really isn't, and we need to be far more acknowledging of that.
It goes back to something Charlotte said earlier as well, that it's okay to feel how you feel and just to acknowledge that. An example of that from my own life recently was a lady in our church died, and I was just weeping in the house. It was just me and the kids, and I was just weeping because somebody I loved had died. And the kids came up, patted me on the shoulder saying, hey, it's okay, Dad, don't cry. And I was just like, you need to know, if you're sad that someone's died, it's appropriate to cry. There's no shame in it or anything. And you look at the life of Christ, and that's exactly what you see, isn't it? When he's there at Lazarus's tomb, even knowing what's about to happen, he weeps. And that for me is a really obvious example when we're faced with death and kind of confronting that. But again, as Christians, we can be rubbish at that we think that we need to have this idea that we've conquered death in Christ, so therefore we're not sad about it. And those two things don't butt up against each other. Yes, Christ has conquered death. That's where our hope is. But that doesn't mean that we're not sorrowful in the face of it, because it still exists. So I think we have barely mentioned this, but we look at Christ, we see his humanity, like highs and lows of his experiences and his emotions were a real part of his humanity. And so that should encourage us to at least be able to feel in the same way, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. And I think as a culture for many years, we've often swept feelings and emotions under the carpet, whether that's been a kind of stiff upper lip scenario, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, the more we share, and the whole, it's okay not to be okay. I think it's really important. It's more honest, and it helps us to reach out for help, and it helps other people to reach out to us.
I think as well, it's fair to acknowledge that men have problems in this area sometimes, I think more than women. And often it's as a result of upbringing, I think, big boys don't cry sort of thing. And I think that, that's something we need to be aware to in churches. The whole issue of male suicide is just appalling, really, in a genuine sense of that word. It's just so tragic. And I think a lot of that is rooted in our inability as men to be able to speak honestly about our feelings. And it's a great thing for churches to model that, because as you say, Sammy, our Lord in his incarnation is perfect humanity, and he dignifies the human experience, and it's the pure human experience. It's not a sinful one. And so we see him expressing affection, when the disciples stop the disciples stop mothers bringing little children to him to bless them. He rebukes them and welcomes them. I don't think that was done in a cold, forensic way. His heart goes out to them. And you see that again and again. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion upon them, for they were as sheep without shepherds, helpless and harassed. And the whole process of the trial of Jesus and the Gethsemane moment, I think there is a massive amount there that's going on that's often overlooked. And he just dignifies what it means to be a human being and a true man. We're running off the back of a culture that just doesn't allow that. And it's great to hear you say you cried over somebody who died because you loved them. They meant a lot to you. And some of us. Sorry, what did I say? Sorry, what did I say? Sorry.
I said I'm still upset. You said it was great to hear that you're
crying. But do you know what I mean? You were able to acknowledge that. You see, I was brought up southwest London. It was a bit stiff upper lip, and it was very much a culture where you just don't do that, and I still struggle with that.
Oh, well, now something
the only time I cried,
my upbringing was that my dad cried when Jason Donovan and Kylie Minogue got married on Neighbours. So I've known from a very early age that it's okay for men to cry. We made fun of him a lot for that, actually, but I've cried at far worse.
Well, it's interesting. I never saw my dad cry. And I remember him when I was a little boy telling me he had cried when his friend John Thomas had died. And I was shocked, because to me, crying was a thing you didn't do. And I only get emotional in that sense, to be honest, when I'm talking to or about God. I've noticed that. I just somehow I'm allowed to do it. But outside of that environment, I struggle with that. And I understand from what Julie's saying that a lot of that is my upbringing, very much so. Yeah.
Okay.
Which I suppose we've all got a lot of work to do, haven't we?
Quick question. Which is better, talking or listening?
Well, the old saying, we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should listen twice as much as we talk. And it's so true that when somebody is talking with us, we are already thinking and formulating what we are going to say back to them. And actually, if we can just take a moment, be quiet, and really give people our full attention, that would help enormously. And I think in the society generally, children will feel they don't get enough time, adults will feel they don't get enough time of people properly listening to us. So it's something we could all work on.
Our other panelists?
Yeah, I understand. I think from Julie's response, I completely agree. I don't entirely understand the question. I don't think, though. In that, I think.
Make of it what you will.
Okay.
Which is better, talking or listening?
I agree with Julie. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Phil, go.
No, go on.
I wasn't going to say anything exciting.
Well, I'd say there's two ways of looking at it, isn't there? If you're needing help, talking is better.
Mm.
And if you're trying to give help, listening is better.
Yeah.
And something mysterious happens when somebody somehow manages to put into words what's going on inside here and here. I don't think anybody understands it. But, you get little glimpses of this, cast your cares upon the Lord because he cares for you. That involves somehow articulating, either verbally or in the quietness of your heart, what's going on. And there's something quite special about that. And it's a terrific privilege to be able to sit with someone and really not say anything. Maybe for 3/4 of an hour, hardly say a thing. But you're watching something quite extraordinary happening. Here is somebody who's trusting you with their story. And as they're speaking, something is going on inside of them. And that can be really, really profound.
I'll ask a genuine question then in response to that, because I believe that 100% that one of the most powerful things I can do when I'm helping people is just to sit in silence, just to listen, just to give them space, sometimes even for them to answer their own questions. But one of the pressures that I feel is that, and not internally, because I'm convinced by that as soon as I open my mouth, I'm probably just going to go off in the wrong direction. But one of the pressures I feel is that when people are being open with me, they expect me to have an answer, to say something there and then. And that if I'm being silent, then that somehow suggests that I don't care or I don't understand, those sorts of things. So what would you say should be done in that sort of situation where I am genuinely seeking to help someone just by giving them the space to be open and to process it themselves? But I also get this impression that they're not going to be satisfied until I've weighed in. I mean, I guess we're all in those sort of professions and capacities where someone is always expecting you to have the answer. So how do you non-verbally help them to see that you are helping them by shutting up?
If they really are talking honestly and earnestly about what's going on, and you are just providing those little cues that reassure and enable them to speak, they will feel better. I think sometimes, Sammy, the pressure we feel as pastors doesn't necessarily come from the person we're trying to help, but it can actually come from the whole issue of what does it mean to be a pastor in these situations. And I think sometimes we have to be willing to sort of just chew your lip, and I'll just say, look, it's more important that this person has this time. And to be honest, over the years, I've helped people who sometimes it's taken them a year, 18 months to actually really talk honestly about what really is the issue. And most of that time is listening and reassuring and just being there with them. But just come back to that. I think if you are doing it right, I think people will. As a pastor, you should always pray with people, actually, or at least offer that. When you can do that, and people do expect that.
I think if you're a church member and you're not sure what to do if somebody approaches you and wants to talk, people don't always want solutions. I suppose it's a little bit about what are they hoping will happen as a result of the conversation. And so you can listen. And if you're feeling a bit unsure, it's okay to say, well, thank you for sharing with me. What should we do now? And the person may well have their own top tips for themselves, what they think will help the situation. And so actually asking people, were they looking for advice? They may not have been looking for your advice at all, may not have wanted it, they just wanted your time and their listening ear. Or they might say, what would you do in my situation? So it does depend, but very often people have got a number of ideas of what they think might help, and that might be back to more sleep, time with others, less alcohol, having a period of sick leave from work. people very often have got a few solutions that they are thinking about trying and want to talk those through with a friend.
Okay, we are coming up to 9 o'clock now, and I don't want us to go later than that. I appreciate all three of you are busy. You've all had busy weeks just gone, and you look staring down the barrel of another busy week. I know all of your situations, trying to make life work in your various contexts through lockdown. Something I think would be really helpful for people to know is what sort of time scales should people be expecting when loved ones, for example, are suffering with mental health issues? What sort of timescales in terms of accessing services? What sort of timescales in terms of kind of, I say visibly, like noticeable improvement in conditions and things like that? One of the things I've encountered as a pastor in the church is that the loved ones of people suffering with mental ill health kind of want or expect things to get sorted out after the first visit to a mental health professional. I can't understand why things aren't progressing faster than that. So expectations are a big thing there. So what sort of timescales can you suggest people should kind of go away into various situations with?
I think it's incredible. Like, this is going to be the most annoying answer, really, but I think it's so individual that it would be really hard to answer that question, because, you know, I've worked with people one session and things have changed and they felt okay and they've moved on. I've worked with people for 26 sessions and nothing's shifted at all. Worked with people who've had mental illness for their whole life, and they're in their 70s and they're still struggling with the same things they were when they were 19. It is hugely variable and does completely depend, I think, on the person, which is a really rubbish and unhelpful answer, but I wouldn't want to give sort of false hope either, because it would totally depend. And I think in terms of services, it depends which service, I suppose, that you'll be referred to, but waiting lists do tend to be quite long for services, but you might get an assessment quite quickly. I know I work in child and adolescent mental health, and you know, we will do assessments quickly, but then people will be put on a list waiting for therapeutic work, but it doesn't tend to be too long, but I wouldn't say too much. But yeah, it can be quite a wait for therapy if that's what people want and need.
I think if you know somebody who's got a mental health problem that is getting steadily worse, or they have never sought help, or you've never sought help about it, I think it's time to really stop and have a think about that. Maybe talk to a friend, and do seek help if you haven't, because there is help out there, and it can help things from getting worse, particularly if you or somebody you know you're really worried about safety. Then don't duck that issue. There's no confidentiality when people have got feelings that they might want to harm themselves. So please do always seek help from somebody about that. It's really hard to, as Charlotte said, it's really hard to put a number on this. But if any symptom that we have that's been going on for some time, we want that to improve. And so we do often need to try some things that we talked about at the start, or certainly go and seek help from your GP about that.
I think anything to do in mental health, rule of thumb, from my experience, it seems to suggest it takes time, a lot more than often people realise. And one of the tricky bits comes, say, for example, somebody's experiencing quite prolonged sadness, and you know, they go to see their doctor and they regard them as being depressed. They may put them on some medication. It's very easy for other family members to think, well, you've got these tablets now, are you feeling better? Or when should you be feeling better? But often it seems, my observation that it's usually about 4 to 6 weeks before there's some sort of discernible change in the individual. And I think a lot of this, it does take a long time. You're dealing with the way people process memories, the way people think about themselves, the way they think about the world around them. And all of these things are very, very complex, and they take time to work through. So if you're looking to support someone who has a mental health or has struggles with their mental well-being, just be prepared to be consistent and patient. And I think, again, this whole idea of boundaries, of not just giving an open door, because you won't sustain that, but trying to approach it in such a way that actually this person may need me just to walk alongside them in this for a long time.
Yeah, and I would say, like, I probably would go back on what I said, because I make it sound like there's no hope for some people, and I don't think that's true at all. I think there's always hope and always the ability for things to change. So I would just add that on to what I said. I wouldn't want people to think, oh, nothing's going to change and this is going to take a lifetime. That's not necessarily the case, and there'll always be ways things can improve for people.
And changing the person is complex, isn't it? Someone may still have their mental health issues and maybe has not made a great deal of progress there, but themselves as a person, in and through it, there can be real changes there. And this is why it's such a fascinating area, all of this. Really is.
Yeah. Guys, appreciate it so much. I'm going to pray to finish, and then I'm going to end the live stream. Is that all right? Yeah, great. Thank you very much, all of you. Lord God, we thank you that you have made us into such wonderfully complex creatures, that we are more than the sum total of our parts, and that there are parts of us as human beings we've barely begun to understand. Lord, we understand that we do live in a broken world, and that the various parts that make us who we are can go out of sync. They can fracture. They can be damaged and distorted. But we thank you that you are a God of restoration. We thank you that you're a God who is content to find brokenness, but isn't content to leave it at brokenness. That you are about making us whole again. That you are about restoring and perfecting all of your creation, us included. I pray, Lord God, you would give us hope in the face of our brokenness, in our struggles and our difficulties. I pray that you would give us wisdom of how to proceed, of who to speak to, of answers to give, of questions to ask, all those sorts of things. Lord, I pray that you would bring about change in people's lives. We've spoken about timescales. Lord, we've spoken about treatments. We've spoken about preventative things. Lord, I pray that there would be change in people's lives. That your goodness, your kindness would be experienced as movement and progression is made. Lord, I thank you so much for the various healthcare professionals we have in the church. I thank you so much for the various healthcare professionals we have in the wider communities that we live in, the NHS people, the third sector people, all those who are committed, Lord, to others, committed to care and love and service. Lord, I thank you for Jesus living such a perfect human life, that we can look to him and we can see the complexities of what it is to be a person. Lord, we can see the genuineness of what it is to respond to situations as a real person. I pray ultimately that we can look to Jesus and we can see hope in the midst of extreme darkness, Lord. I pray for anybody who is watching along live or will watch along later, will have got this far, Lord God. I pray that they, though maybe going through dark times, will see that the sun is risen, that the light has come, that there is hope. Lord, give them courage to reach out, to talk, to be open, Lord, to desire themselves to change and to grow and to heal. We thank you for your goodness to us in so many ways. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Amen. Well, guys, everyone online, thank you so very much for tuning in. If you want to catch up again, it's going to be staying up on YouTube, and we're going to be chucking it on Facebook as well. Can I also just say, final notice, our YouTube channel is up to 199 subscribers, which really makes me uncomfortable. I would just like it to be over 200. So if you are watching at any point and you haven't subscribed, even if you don't know what subscribing does, or you will never make use of that feature, just do it for me. I don't like it being on 199. That's just annoying. So go ahead and subscribe to that. You'll also be notified when we do various things like this in the future. Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thank you very much, Phil. It's been a pleasure. So I think officially you're supposed to end Zoom meetings by waving at each other as well, aren't you?
Zoom wave, yeah.